I'll tell you a little bit about my family's journey, homeschool journey, and how it began. My husband's one of 7 kids. He's the oldest, and he was homeschooled back before it was cool, back in the early 90s. So he has a history of homeschool. I, on the other hand, do not. I was raised in the public schools, and I became a public school teacher right out of college, taught for 4 years, then got my master's degree in counseling. And this was during the time period when we were starting to have a family. And so right before my second child was born, I graduated with my master's in counseling and decided to stay at home for a little while. And of course, the call to homeschool was there. I had already thought about it. My husband and I had talked about it, and honestly, I think the year was about 2017 when we started really looking into classical education. So that's where our journey began. We looked at classical conversations, to be specific. And so I'm going to be talking from my unique perspective, and I might be looking down at my notes a little bit because honestly, guys, I have a lot written down and I cannot memorize as well as I used to. But I just want to talk about classical education. It can be characterized in various ways, but 2 main lists come to mind when I'm trying to talk to somebody about what classical education is. The first list goes something like this. Classical education pursues virtue. It uses tools to learn in layers like knowledge, understanding, then wisdom. It celebrates the integration of knowledge. And then the other very similar list is classical education follows the pattern of the trivium, is language focused rather than image focused, and is centered around the story of history. Okay, let's define our terms. You're probably thinking, what is trivium? And if you haven't heard of trivium, well then, here you go. According to the Well-Trained Mind book by Susan Wise Bauer and Jessie Bauer, that is a book that a lot of people who are interested in classical education will read. But of course, there are other ones out there that you can look into. And they're basing their methods on something they've read by Dorothy Sayers, an essay that she wrote many years ago. But all that to say, we go back to thousands of years ago when we talk about classical education. It's been around for a while. And honestly, it started to dwindle in our country about the time of the Civil War. And then by the 1950s, classical education was all but gone in our country. So it's making a comeback thanks to that publication. They republished it of Dorothy Sayers' essay, but that was back in the 1980s. And so now we have a resurgence of classical education. And it's really kind of neat to see it come back. So what is the trivium? That was a big rabbit trail. But what was the trivium? What is the trivium? Well, it's a 3-part pattern. Okay, so first, the mind must be supplied with facts and images. This is called the grammar stage. If you're learning something for the first time, you must learn the grammar or terminology of what you are learning. You're learning to bake cookies. You got to learn chocolate chips, flour, butter, sugar, brown sugar, all these different ingredients. You have to learn oven. You have to learn bake. You have to learn all the different methods and tools and all the things you used. So grammar stage. Next, the mind must be given the logical tools for organizing those facts and images. This is called the logic stage or the dialectic stage. It's when you start to understand the process. And then lastly, the mind must be given finally, the mind must be equipped to express conclusions. This is called the rhetoric stage. Each stage correlates with an age range. So the grammar stage is kindergarten through 5th grade. The dialectic or logic stage is 6th grade through 8th grade. And the rhetoric stage is 9th grade through 12th grade. Now that we've defined trivium, does it make some sense? You probably have some questions like, do all children in any given stage fit nicely into the box and never utilize thinking skills outside of their prescribed stage? No. Think about adults. We actually go through the trivium, all three stages of the trivium, anytime that we learn something new from start to finish. I just use that baking cookies example because the nice man that conducted our practicum this weekend used that as an analogy. But I mean, you could apply it to so many different things. But I'll stick with baking cookies. I'm not a baker, but the baking cookies analogy, you learn the ingredients, the tools, the methods first. That's the grammar stage. Then you learn, I could add some baking soda, and the more baking soda I add, the more fluffy my cookies are going to be. Okay, you're learning more about the process. You're understanding the process better. The dialectic stage, you're comparing things. And then the rhetorical stage is when you're able to get to the point to just sit down and tell somebody how to bake chocolate chip cookies. You might have even created your own recipe and you share that with other people. So now you know the trivium. And those of you who are new to classical education, let me give you 3 things to take away. A couple of these things I gleaned from the practicum, but some of these are my own musings. So, number 1.
You spoke a lot about the trivium, and I'm going to interject here. Hi, I'm a homeschool parent who likes the ideas behind classical education, but I want to know more about it than just the trivium, okay? So you gave us 2 lists, and there are some other things on those lists other than the trivium, but can I just talk a little bit about some of the other ideas behind classical education? Thank you. Karen Glass, in her 2014 work, Consider This, Charlotte Mason and the Classical Tradition, wrote about an elephant and used an analogy. Some people might describe the elephant as being like a rope. Okay, so what part of the elephant is the rope? We know it's the trunk. And this would not be a fitting analogy or a fitting way to describe the whole elephant, right? So this is akin to people saying classical education is the trivium. Hold your horses. Did you know that there is so much more to classical education than just the trivium? Karen Glass writes, anytime we approach a subject and look at the discrete parts instead of the whole, we are in danger of missing the elephant. So the trivium may be a part of the whole, but it is not the whole itself. Classical education is so much more. If you want to actually get acquainted with the classical thinkers of the past, like Charlotte Mason did, instead of merely knowing about classical education, I invite you to read Consider This, Charlotte Mason and the Classical Tradition by Karen Glass. The heart of the classical ideal is humility and synthetic thinking. It is natural for a child to develop a relationship with knowledge and wholeness from the beginning of his life. Think about people. Children have been seeing people from the very beginning of their life. So they know people. And if you were to task a child with putting parts of the body together to make a whole person, he would probably have no trouble with this task because he is well acquainted with the synthetic whole. He has firsthand acquaintance with a whole person. So the parts of the whole are secondary. He will have no trouble doing that. Therefore, Glass asserts we should introduce all knowledge in this way. She writes, we should allow them from the beginning to have the opportunity of making firsthand acquaintance with whole things. On page 121 of Consider This. Charlotte Mason was all about humility and synthetic approach to learning. So rather than just using the trivium as a basis for understanding classical education, please read this book. It's worth your time, I promise, and it's only 134 pages long. I hope this gives you a little something more to think about. Stay tuned for my next video on classical education.